Today, we're going to talk about what you can do in your very first piano lesson with a new student who is either 4, 5, or 6-year old. So the very first thing that I have to mention is that it is a huge responsibility to teach young children. That's because they have had no contact, usually most of the time they've had no contact with the piano before in an official setting. They've had no lessons, they are very young, and it is our job as teachers to make them even more excited about learning how to play and appreciate it and be excited so they can keep coming back. So generally speaking, 4, 5, or 6-year olds have shorter attention span, they're energetic, and they get bored easily. So my number one recommendation for you would be to switch activities often and to not be afraid to get off the bench while keeping it educational but also fun for these children. So the very first thing that we're going to do when a student walks in, obviously we're going to have to introduce ourselves. So for most children, this is a nerve-wracking thing because they do not know you, they've never been to your house or your studio, they might not even know they have a piano lesson, they might not even want to be there. So all of these things could be taken into consideration, especially when you have not met that child before. So the very first thing that we're going to do is introduce ourselves. I like to do this by asking about their day, about asking how their week went, and usually I'll make silly jokes like, "Oh, I heard you're 10, right?" when they're obviously not 10, they might be 5, and most of the time they take this as a compliment for some reason, but I play this by ear because obviously it depends on the child and how comfortable you think they might be. I like to ask questions like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite activity? Do you have any siblings? Just questions to loose them up and get to know about the student, see how mature they are, get a sense of their personality, and so on and so forth. So please do not be afraid to be silly, because the more open and the more vulnerable you are, the more student will feel comfortable, at least in my experience. This can be debatable, so I'm just sharing my experience. After that, assuming that you feel like you have gathered enough information about the introduction, you can move on to the next stage. Before we move on to that, it is very important to also think about what a shy student might react to. So for example, if you ask open-ended questions like, how are you, what did you do last weekend, things like that, to a student who's shy or who doesn't want to be there, they might not say anything. This used to be very frustrating to me when I started teaching preschool or very shy students in general, that I would think it was about me, that I was not asking the questions correctly, but it was just that they did not know what to say and they felt overwhelmed by the information that I was presenting to them. So this is important to consider. Maybe you can ask things like, do you like the color blue? Do you like the color red? At least you get a yes or no question from them that might be more comfortable to them. After this stage of the introduction, we talk about keyword geography. So I will usually ask students, what do you notice? And this depends on their age and their maturity level and their interest, but let's say that they will tell me that they see white and black, which is obviously what you notice. Then I'll go another step further and I'll ask, do you notice anything about the color black? Is there any pattern or is there anything special about it? If they just tell me 2 versus 3, that's amazing, but let's say that they will not. So usually what I like to do is I like to ask them, how many keys do you see over here? And at this point, 4 or 5-year-olds can count up to 10 comfortably, so they'll say 1, 2, and then I'll start saying, what about here? And they'll say 1, 2, 3. So you get the idea. They might not be able to recognize the concept of 2 versus 3, but at least they can say how many there are here, how many there are here, and so on. I like to use this resource by vibrant music teachers. It's Dogs versus Gates, where Nicola has little sheets. They're very pretty, that fit perfectly in the correct space of blacks and white keys. I like to use the resource by Vibrant Music Teachers by Nicola that is called Dogs versus Gates, I believe. I always want to say cats. Dogs versus gates that fit perfectly in the shape of the groups of 2 and then groups of 3. Then after that, we will obviously talk about how you can play the keys. At this point, this is their very first time playing. After they have noticed about the colors, I will ask them to play something. So what I usually do before we talk about groups of 2 versus 3, we like to talk about improvising, because I want to see how they follow directions, but I also want to see how they explore. Do they explore on their own? Are they afraid of making mistakes? Things like that. So I like to use Forrest Kinney's Create first. So since the child at this point is familiar with the concept of black versus white keys, we'll play something like this one, Sunrise. So you can create sounds by playing on black keys. You can play on any black keys. You can use the right hand, you can use the left hand. You can try to restrict this by saying, well, playing the groups of 2, or only playing the groups of 3, or then use both, things like that. So the teacher will play, you know, just this, all in a loop. And then the student might do, or very simple if they're not responding well to improvisation. You can try to imitate them too, so they feel a little bit more secure. You can improvise too. I'm not the biggest improviser, but I love using these resources. So Create first by Forrest Kinney. After that, so at this point we have introduced to each other, we have played some improvisations, we've learned about keyboard geography. Next, I like to teach them how to sit. Now you can do this in the beginning, but I find that for very young children who do not like to sit down and who move a lot and who are very energetic, if you first say how to sit in the piano, they will be a little bit more resistant. So it's, in my experience, it's better to let them experience the beauty of music before you try to tell them about technique. But both are very important, of course. It just depends on what works for you, and at the moment, this works for me. So at this point, I will use different concepts, but one of the concepts that I love using is from Irina Goren's Tales of a Musical Journey. And I'm not sitting correctly at the moment because I have a student, because usually students like to sit higher for me because they're tiny. What I like to do is I like to tell them, well, if I tell them about the L shape, obviously that's not going to make any sense to some of these children. So I will start by thinking of bigger arm movements or whole body movements. So I will let them kind of move their arms very, very flexibly, if that's a word. Then I'll have them do this, then I'll have them do this, so they understand the concept that we play in the piano, not just with our fingers, but with our wrist, with our elbows. Obviously, I'll make some jokes like, well, obviously we don't play like this, but we still use our whole arm to create beautiful sounds. And don't be afraid at this point to get off the bench. You can do like a hanging willow tree, I believe Irina Goren calls this. So the same thing, when they first put their hands on the piano, make sure that they understand that this is a very important task. You shouldn't just slam the keys, but you should think about the sound that you want to create. So obviously this is much easier for me, but for a 4 or 5 year old who does not have fine motor skills, it is important to guide them to start using finger number 3, in my experience. You can do 2 as well, but 3 is the best at this time for me. So have them and guide them to do this movement, kind of like they're taking something from their pocket, maybe. Not as dramatic as me, but usually they won't do it that much. Okay, and then have them understand that they go to the bottom of the key, not like this, not like this. So the wrist has to move. Obviously, you might not know about all of these, and I encourage you to look at Irina Gorin's website, Facebook group, and her method books. So I'll use some of that to talk to them about how to sit in the piano. Now this can be very short or it can be very long. I just try not to bore them. As soon as I see some resistance, sorry about that, it's from the road. As soon as I see some resistance from the student, I will try to switch the topic and then come back to it later. So after that, next is learning a new song or a new piece. I call them songs at first, so it's more exciting, but again, this can be debatable. I like to use Piano Safari or Little Gems from Pola Dreyer, I believe, or Dreyer, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering the name. So we might start doing Charlie Chipmunk, and there's a recording of that on YouTube, but I'd encourage you to check out Piano Safari and their methods. So a lot of students who, well, most of 4 or 5-year-olds will do this, depends on their developmental stage, but it's something like Charlie Chipmunk skippers by, and then you go down, and this one is with a 2. Now if I decide to use Irina Gorin's methodologies, that starts with finger number 3, so it may be confusing. I can adjust accordingly. Instead of 2, I can have the student play with finger number 3, but still have a song they can learn at the end of the lesson and be excited to show me later. Now, if you find that you have like an amazing 4 or 5-year-old who just did this with no problem, you can add the challenge of doing 2 hands or switching finger numbers, or you can kind of vary it based on what you see fit. After this, we will talk about maybe rhythm values. So this depends. There might not be enough time for this, or if someone finds all of the previous activities very easy, I will try to fit other educational things. So in this case, if I just tell them, if I tell them quarter note, half note, sometimes they'll understand but not really feel the rhythm. So what I like to say is short and then long, short and then long, because usually they'll say, well, quarter note, you think 1 beat, it's like 1 second. That's what most of my students say. And then if it's a half note, they say, oh, it's like 2 seconds, which is not necessarily true, because it obviously depends on how fast or slow you're doing it. So it's important to encourage that relationship between quarter notes and half notes. What I like to do is get off the bench and I'll ask them to walk maybe towards me or away from me in quarter notes. So I'll say walk, 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 or quarter, 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 and I try to be silly so we have more fun doing it. After that, I will ask them to do a long note, so half note, or something like half note, and usually if you're silly, again, they will have a blast. Then I like to go a little bit extra by, well, you might debate if it's extra, but I like to have them walk in quarters while I walk in half notes, and then we can switch. So they are exposed to the relationship between those notes. So at this point, we have talked about some theory, we have talked about technique, we have learned our first rote song, we have obviously we have connected with each other, hopefully, we have improvised, and I don't think there's anything else that we could do in the first piano lesson. So you can talk about practice with them, you can talk at the end of the lesson and say, what did you learn today? Would you recommend piano to a new student? And usually that's, they will say, yeah, it was fun. It kind of depends, I guess. But that's pretty much what I do in the very first piano lesson with preschool students. This is very simplified. At times, I might only work on 3 things what I talked about. I might improvise in the moment, or if they're very quick learners, I'll try to throw more at them. So it all depends, but I'm just showing you a general thing of what I try to go for. when I have these lessons. So if you have any questions or any advice for me and other teachers, please let me know down below, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.